Do the clap.
And I don't know if you remember the talk you gave. It was on the limits of forgiveness based on Simon Wiesenthal's work and your own work. And it was just a brilliant presentation. And I said, my God, I really want you to be part of the CC community.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And then before I give more of a formal introduction, I'd like to have Jennifer Fidel say a few words. She is now the program director of public programming for us, or director of public programming. So Jennifer, and you put this together, you want to say a few words about the series and how you understand it?
Yes, well, hello to everyone, and glad to see so many people on tonight, and thank Susannah for agreeing to do this tonight. We really started this in January. It's been a long thought out idea to have lecture series for the public from a CC, and we really got it started off to a really big way, I think. So Michael's dream, you know, I'm sure all of us have been in the CC taking classes, but he's wanting to, you know, expand what is offered and how we learn. And so the public programming really is going to be a series of lectures that are offered to the general public and also to our core students. And they're all represent what we've been studying, you know, the archetypal patterning, the psychology, culture, science, literature, myth. There's going to be all, any subjects that we talk about is going to be a chance to go deeper into these studies. And so we're organizing these. This first session is the 2020 Vision Lecture. We've got, of course, we've got Susannah Heschel tonight. We're going to have Eduardo Caravallo in May. And then in the fall, we're going to have Suzanne Kremen, and she's going to speak, I think, on Australia. And then Jennifer Selig is going to finish us up in November for this set of 4. And it's going to go through the whole year. And so that's exciting. We've also got another series coming up, which is going to be themed on exile and homecoming. So we've got several students and teachers of the CC that are going to offer 4 lectures there that all encompass that the study of the archetype of the homecoming and exile and the journey back home. That's what we've got on board now. We'd like to expand it in the future to hear more from our graduate students. And so I'd like to say, being new at this and just getting this started, if any of you have any ideas of who you'd like to hear from, any subjects that you'd like to explore further, please send me any comments, any suggestions. You can email me at a CC. I know Annette's got the number, but it the email address. So just, you know, chime in and let me know how things, you know, are going with you if you feel like there's something you'd like to hear from. Other than that, I'd like to get started. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jennifer. I know it's a lot of work. And Jennifer, in terms of the transdisciplinary background that we have, before coming into psychology, she was a costume designer for the opera and the theater. And, you know, we have people from all walks of life doing this. And it makes sense because, you know, Jung once said, the latter part of his career, if you want to understand psyche, we need to bring together people from the arts, people from psychology, people from business and physics to learn a little bit about each other's discipline, because psyche is manifest in all these different domains and also different countries. You know, something I adore. I grew up in a very tight Southern Italian family. We're from Sicily, and I love cross-cultural studies. And we have over 100, maybe 100 some people sign up for the call tonight. Some will be listening afterwards. But even right now, I see we have probably 10 different countries represented, from Colombia, from Ecuador, from Qatar, Venezuela originally, Canada. We've got somebody here from Brooklyn, a couple of Brooklyn people. It's another country we have. A number of different, some of the large towns in Colombia. So look, I love it. And this is we're beginning our 31st year of training, which, you know, it's a wonderful feeling seeing something you love grow like this. So, as a way of introducing Dr. Heschel, I'd like to read something tonight. It's from, I think, one of the most beautiful books written. It's called The Sabbath, written by somebody she knew pretty well, Rabbi Heschel. And I'd never, ever introduced Dr. Susannah Heschel as being Rabbi Heschel's daughter, because she's such a giant in her own right. And she wrote the introduction. Let me just read for about 2 minutes here, because I think it's a beautiful piece. This is her introduction in the book. And she writes, let me get my ruler. I can read that. Friday evenings in my home were the climax of the week, as they are for every religious Jewish family. My mother and I kindled the lights for the Sabbath, and all of a sudden I felt transformed, emotionally and even physically. After lighting the candles in the dining room, we would walk into the living room, which had windows overlooking the Hudson River, facing west, and we would marvel at the sunset that would soon arrive. The sense of peace that came upon us as we kindled the lights was created, in part by the hectic tension of Fridays. Hold on. Okay, I try to mute everybody. Hold on. Preparation for a holy day, my father often said, was important. Preparation for a holy day, my father often said, was important as the day itself. During the busy mornings, my mother shopped for groceries. In the afternoon, the atmosphere grew increasingly nervous as she cooked. My father came home from his office an hour or two before sunset to take care of his own preparations. And as the last minutes of the work came to a close, both of my parents were in the kitchen, frantically trying to remember what they might have forgotten to prepare. As the kettle boiled, was the bleach with, what's that word? How do you say the word?
Blech. The blech. Yes, this is the covering for the stove.
Covering the stove. Was the oven turned on? And the final part, which is so beautiful. Then suddenly it was time. 20 minutes before sunset, whatever hadn't been finished in the kitchen, we simply left behind as we lit the candles and blessed the arrival of the Sabbath. My father writes, the Sabbath comes like a caress, wiping away fear, sorrow, and somber memories. And I think that writing captures so much of what I've grown to love and respect about Dr. Heschel. In terms of credentials, she's the chair of Judaic Studies at Dartmouth. She lectures all over the world, author of many works, from the Holocaust to religious studies to the great Hasidic masters. And you can read her bio, but I think tonight you're going to get a feel for what her work and what her soul is about. Dr. Heschel, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was lovely what you read, and thank you for your warm introduction. It's wonderful always to be with you, Michael, and with members of the Assisi Institute. Let me just ask if everybody can hear me. Is it all right as I'm speaking?
Can you
Yes?
mute everyone, Michael? I still
Yes,
hear.
everybody should mute their
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody mute
computers.
yourself, okay?
Yeah. So I am going to talk today about the veil and what the veil represents, primarily in Jewish tradition, but with some comments also about Christianity, about Islam. I'm going to begin with the Bible, but I want to just explain why I'm talking about the veil and how this came about. So first of all, let me say that when I was growing up, my family is Hasidic, very, very pious. And whenever one of my cousins got married, the bride would walk down the aisle in, of course, fully covered in a beautiful white dress that was up to the neck and down to the wrists and down to the floor. But at the ceremony, walking down the aisle, she would also be veiled. Now, most brides everywhere wear some kind of head covering or veil, fine. But in my family, the veil was a very thick piece of cloth that was tied around the bride's face. And it was so thick that you couldn't see through it. So we couldn't see her face. She couldn't see us. She had to be escorted down the aisle by her parents. And she couldn't see anything that was going on in the room. She couldn't see the guests. She couldn't see the groom or the rabbi or anyone. And to me, growing up, I always thought that was just awful. I always thought she's like a cow, blindfolded and being led to the slaughter. That was my thought. And I never would do anything like that. All right, so I don't want to make this too heteronormative, but I will just tell you that then it was my turn and I did get married and I had a wedding, and of course my religious relatives were present and so on. And it was time for a dress and a veil. So I needed some kind of veil because actually there's a Jewish ritual even before you walk down the aisle the bride is sitting in a chair and with her family, and the groom comes in with his family and then lowers a veil over her face and blesses her, and family blesses her, and so forth. But what kind of veil? Well, I was not going to wear that thick cloth. And instead I wore some kind of crinoline, many layers of it, but I could certainly still see, and I could be seen. And then as I entered the room and started to walk down that aisle, I suddenly realized this is terrible, a big mistake. Because in that moment, what I wanted was not to be seen. I wanted privacy. I didn't want to have to worry about what kind of expression I should put on my face. Should I have a big smile? Should I look solemn? I didn't want to be seen. I wanted my feelings to be for myself, private. And so I regretted my decision. And it gave me a different understanding of what veiling is all about, and what, at least what it could mean in different contexts, depending on how we want to interpret it. So that moment I mentioned because it's probably the only moment in my life when a veil becomes important. But it's certainly something, veiling, that appears frequently in the Bible and in subsequent Jewish commentaries. And so I began to wonder about what we mean when we speak of a veil, why we make such a fuss over Muslim women wearing a veil, why that is so upsetting to us, and why some of the customs that do appear in certain religious traditions are ignored, because after all, in the New Testament, St. Paul wants women in church to wear a veil. So what I want to do is go back, first of all, to the book of Exodus and think about how veiling begins to appear there in relationship to Moses. Moses, of course, covers his face on the one hand when he encounters God, and I'll go over the passages in a moment. On the other hand, he wants to see God. And one of the interesting questions is whether God has a veil. There is a desire in the Bible to see God, even though we've been told over and over again that there is no image of God. And in fact, in the Ten Commandments, the first commandment is, don't make an image of God. So we're not supposed to make an image of God, and yet we speak in the Bible over and over again of the body of God, the finger of God, the face of God, the back of God. So does God have a body? Why can't it be seen, or can it be seen? Or is God veiled? Or are we veiled and unable to see God? So the veiling raises quite a few different kinds of questions. Now, let me begin just by running through the context of this as it appears first in the book of Exodus. And let me just add to this that the overriding issue with veiling and seeing God, has to do with intimacy, longing, desire, the desire and the longing to see God as a form of intimacy with God. So that's where I'm going to be heading. But coming to the book of Exodus, it opens with the story of Moses' mother giving birth to Moses and putting him in a little ark and setting the little ark on the river, because all the Israelite mothers are supposed to have their firstborn sons killed by the order of the Pharaoh. And the first chapter talks about the midwives who are called before Pharaoh and say, well, why didn't you kill these babies? And the midwives lie and they say, well, these Israelite mothers give birth so quickly that the baby's born before we can even get there. So this is a nice story. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that, the birth of the hero that Otto Rank wrote about, among others. And then comes chapter 2. In chapter 2, Moses grows up after being adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter, and he sees an Egyptian beating an Israelite. And he's so angry that he takes revenge and he kills the Egyptian. After killing him, he has to flee, and he goes to a region called Midian, where he marries a woman, the daughter of a Midianite priest. Her name is Zipporah. And then in chapter 3 comes the burning bush. The burning bush. Moses sees a bush, it's on fire, but the bush is not consumed. And so we have to look at that moment of the burning bush. Moses realizes that there's something holy in that bush, something extraordinary. That God says to him, you're standing on holy ground. Take off your shoes, your sandals, and he does. And he bows, he covers his face. And there's something quite extraordinary about that someone encountering a holy moment, a moment of revelation, wants to hide, to cover the eyes. And we might want to think together about what that means, that we would want to cover our eyes. Is it out of fear of being overwhelmed, fear of this burning bush? Is it out of modesty? Is the intimacy just too strong, too great that you need to have a veil at that moment? But we can come back when we look at some other veiling passages. But the burning bush is one where God speaks to Moses and tells him to go to Pharaoh. The verse 6 in chapter 3 says, Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And of course, that's suggesting that there's something to look at. In chapter 4, Moses decides he's going to go back to Egypt. And along the way, his wife, Zipporah, circumcises him. It's a very bizarre passage that no one's ever been able to figure out what it's doing there and why. What does that have to do with anything? Okay. Chapters 5 to 11 are about the plagues that God sends on the Egyptians because Pharaoh refuses to let the Israelites go. And then chapter 13 is about the Exodus and the Passover, what to do. Chapter 14, the Egyptians pursue the Israelites and they drown in the Red Sea. In chapter 15, the Israelites, having passed through the dry land through the sea, sing a song to God. Finally, we come to chapter 19, Mount Sinai, and chapter 20, the Ten Commandments, followed by chapters 21 through 23 about various laws. In chapter 24, Moses goes up the mountain. This is Mount Sinai. And there, in verses 15 through 18, God's glory appears. And that's something worth thinking about here. God's glory appears, and Moses enters into a cloud to encounter God, to speak with God. The cloud is an important metaphor. It reappears, of course, in the New Testament in the Transfiguration scene. But God's glory, what is God's glory? I'll just mention that the Hebrew word for glory is kavod. You can write it K-A-V-O-D. And the word itself can be translated also as honor or as dignity. So the dignity of a man is kavod hadam. But it also means glory. And there's a question we can ask, what is the glory of God? What do we mean by divine glory? There are some people in some Bible translations that translate kavod as presence, but I don't think that's correct. And I'll give you, as we go through some of this, I'll give you some examples of how the word kavod is also used about human beings. And I think it has a very different meaning, almost as a counterbalance to soul, a kind of soul, maybe part of the soul, a higher soul, but it has that connotation. So Moses encounters God's glory. And then moving on, in chapter 33, which is the chapter after the golden calf episode, Moses asks to see God. And this is a crucial moment in chapter 33. It comes after the revelation at Mount Sinai, the giving of the Ten Commandments, the laws that come from God. In chapter 33, verse 11, Moses is said to speak to God, quote, face to face, as one man speaks to another. That's very striking. In verse 17, God knows Moses' name. In verse 18, Moses tells God, show me your kavod, your glory. Show me your kavod. And God responds by saying, no man can see me and live. In verse 23, God allows Moses to see his back, not his face, not his kavod, but his back. But then what happens to Moses? Right after this vision of God's back, the Bible says that Moses' own face is transformed. And this comes to a very interesting debate about how to understand what that means. So Moses has just spent 40 days and nights reinscribing the second time the 10 Commandments, because the first time he smashed them when he saw the golden calf. So he's been up on the mountain 40 days and nights, reinscribing the 10 Commandments. He's had nothing to eat or drink. And then he descends from the mountain in chapter 34, verse 29, and it says the following. As Moses came down from the mountain bearing the 2 tablets of the covenant, Moses was not aware that the skin of his face radiated, since he had spoken with God. Now, radiated, what does that mean? The Hebrew is keren or. Keren or. Keren means, according to some translations, it means horns. And you'll see, for example, that Michelangelo's Moses that's in a church in Rome depicts Moses seated, holding the 10 Commandments, and 2 small horns coming out of the top of his head. Jerome, translating the Bible into Latin, translated keren as horns. But is that really what it means? Now I have to tell you that I have a friend, a Bible scholar, who took keren or. What about or? The word or here means skin. It can mean skin. And my friend Bill Propp argued that after coming down from the mountain, being with God, seeing God, Moses' face developed pocks. He had pock marks all over his face. Horny skin is how he translates keren or, horny skin. Well, literally speaking, the translation makes sense, but it doesn't have a meaning. Why would you encounter God and all of a sudden you have horns coming out of your face? And then, of course, it says that Moses veiled himself. Did he veil himself because his skin got so ugly? What, he had acne and he had to cover his face like a teenager? Doesn't really make sense.
You probably changed, hopefully, the corporate landscape all across America.
Senator Warren, that is a very serious charge that you leveled at the mayor. Yes, older women should get an abortion. What evidence do you have of that? Her own words. And Mayor Bloomberg, could you respond to this?
Never said it. Period. End of story. Categorically, never said it. When I was accused of doing it, couldn't figure out when.
Somebody's, we need to mute somebody.
Okay.
Okay.
So to come back to this, Moses puts a veil on his face after encountering God. No man can see me and live, God says. But Moses does see God, and he does continue to live, but he's transformed. That we know. It's as if he's no longer merely human. Something has happened to him to transform him. Now, when he puts on the veil, in some sense, he becomes a person that other people can't look at. Other people can't look at him, but when he goes into the temple, later to the Mishkan, to the place of dwelling where the 10 Commandments are kept, he's able to lift his veil. I have to mention that the word for veil in Hebrew, masveh, is a word that only appears in this verse in the Bible, nowhere else. And so the meaning of it is difficult to understand what exactly it means, because we're translating it as veil, understanding it as veil only because of the context of this verse. It may have had a different meaning, we don't know. So it's what's called a hapax legomenon, a word that only appears in this one place whose meaning is derived from this particular context. The root of the word is probably garment. So that's why the assumption is that Moses covered his face. Now, the other question here is, why does Moses, who's had this incredibly profound experience of seeing God face to face, why would he want to cover his face? What is the connection between the intimacy between the human and the divine that makes the human want to be covered, not to be seen by other people? Moses, when he prays to God, will lift the veil, but when he's out in public, he covers his face. I'm going to come back to that when I come to some of the conclusions of this, but I want to mention a few other aspects of this. There are other places in the Bible where God is seen, and seen in the flesh, so to speak. And I'll just mention a couple of verses in passing. So for instance, in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1, I saw my Lord sitting on a throne high and lifted up. His clothing filled the palace. This is a beautiful passage. It goes on in the book of Isaiah. Very beautiful, about his vision of God and the angels circulating. In Amos chapter 9, verse 1, he says, I saw God standing at the altar. Elsewhere in the book of Kings and in Chronicles, hear thou the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by him on his right hand and on his left. Now, of course, this may trouble some lay people because we're always told that God has no body. But it's clear that God does have a body. We are not to represent it in physical form with a sculpture, a statue, but certainly we have a verbal, iconic religion, depictions of God in language. But what we also see are differences even within the Bible. So for example, in the book of Deuteronomy, the claim is made that yes, there is a body, that God has a body, one body. It lives exclusively in heaven and never comes down to earth. Whereas in Genesis and Exodus, God does come down to earth and interact with Moses, for example, and with the children of Israel. What about the angels? What are they? Are they intermediaries, or are they somehow representatives? One of the arguments that's made has to do with God's presence versus God's transcendence. God is up in heaven, far away, beyond all of us, on the one hand, and on the other hand, in our midst, immanent, present, among us. The angels that appear in the Bible somehow seem to be suggesting, in biblical times, the idea that God can come down through angels, come down to earth, as if they're beginning to think as a kind of preview of the idea that there is not only a transcendence to God, but an immanence. And of course, what's so striking in Judaism is the way God's transcendence comes to be understood as male and God's immanence as female. The word in Hebrew for God's immanent presence is Shekhinah. The noun grammatically is female, but it's only in the Middle Ages that the word takes on feminine aspects, probably under the influence of Christian idealization of the Virgin Mary. So God's immanence is like the Virgin Mary in that sense. It's similar in Jewish texts, especially in medieval Jewish mystical texts. But, underlying all of this is the question of the emotion. Why the desire to see God? So there's a premise here that God has a body and can be seen by us. God says, you can't see me and live, but nonetheless gives Moses a glimpse. But what about this desire? The desire to see God is all over the Bible. Why? Why is that so important? In the Bible, it's not unusual to hear God. God speaks, we hear, whether it's at Mount Sinai or elsewhere, God's speaking all the time and being heard. That's nothing special. But it's the seeing that becomes so important. And that's interesting. And I think that also is linked to the question of the role of the veil in religion. So this desire, I'll just give you a few examples of how it's expressed. Some of these are very well known. From the Psalms, for instance, Psalm 42:3. My soul thirsts for God, the living God. Sama nafshi, my soul thirsts for God, the living God. Oh, when will I come and see the face of God? It's a beautiful passage. In Isaiah chapter 6, verse 5, woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my own eyes have seen the King, Lord of hosts. Psalm 27, verse 8, my heart says of you, seek my face. Your face, O Lord, I will seek. So there is thirsting, longing, certainly for God's presence, for religious experience, for being transformed by it, as Moses was, by the experience of God's presence. Some commentators get nervous about this, and they take the Hebrew where it says, I will see God, and then change it, and they put it in the passive. They say, I will be seen by God, because it's so daring to see. And that's the other question of the veil. Is the veil about what we see or who sees us? Do we want to be seen by God, or do we want to see God? And that comes back to my experience at the wedding when I realized, I wanted to see everybody, but I didn't want them to see me. But here we have this longing to see God, not just to hear God, to see God. And if we think about the word glory, Moses says he wants to see God. And God says, you can't see my face. No man can see my face and live. You shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen, in Exodus 33. Nowhere does Moses later on say, I have seen God. He gets some kind of glimpse, a hint. And that too is interesting, because it suggests to us that perhaps it's just the hint, the glimpse that we want, and not the full face, which can be overwhelming. Maybe that's what God means. If you see my face, you won't be able to live. Because some religious experiences or even emotional experiences can be so powerful that they are overwhelming and we can't survive them. Something that can be so glorious and extraordinary can even be traumatic. Now, what about this word kavod and glory? The root of the word kavod actually means heavy in Hebrew. It means heavy, but the way it's used, obviously, it doesn't mean about God in these conventional terms. You don't say, Moses wants to see God's dignity or God's honor or God's heaviness. It doesn't make sense. And what's interesting is that in some Psalms, and I'll mention quickly 30:13, 16:9, 57:9, 7:6, or even in Genesis 49:6, 108:2, the Psalms, my heart is steadfast. I will sing and give praise even with my glory. So glory isn't limited to God. And that's interesting. We have glory too. What would that mean in this case? We can possess glory and God possesses glory. What is this glory? I will sing and give praise to God with my glory. With my glory. What is that? Not with my mouth, not with my songs, but specifically with my glory. In the book of Job, chapter 9, verse 11, it says, God passes by me, and I see him not. He moves on, but I do not perceive him. So it's also possible for God to pass by, and I don't perceive, I don't experience. God is there, but I'm not able to perceive. Is that because I lack glory? Am I wearing a veil? What is that about? Now, does veiling, and here's the central question that I'm interested in, does veiling shield us, or does veiling open us to something deeper, greater perception? There are different interpretations in Jewish tradition from different points of view, and I'll mention some of them. There are some commentaries that say that Moses always wore the veil when he spoke to the people, even when he was teaching them about the commandments of God. And they base this on the last verse here that I'm going to read from Exodus chapter 34, verse 35. Moses would then put the veil back on his face until he went in to speak with God. That means he was only unveiled when he spoke to God and veiled before the people. Why? Because they were terrified of him and his appearance? Or was there something startling about his appearance that frightened them? Was he somehow radiating something of godliness that was too difficult for them to absorb, since they themselves were not veiled? Moses, it says, spoke to God face to face, Exodus 33:11. So he's in completely direct connection with God, face to face. Some interpretations say that Moses was radiating a reflection of the glow of God. Moses is called in Deuteronomy chapter 33, Ish Elohim, the man of God, because he has the brilliance, the radiance of God. And that's why Moses must be veiled, so that the people will not be overwhelmed by the godly light emanating from him. Moses is veiled because he becomes godlike after speaking to God face to face, and the Israelites have to be cautious in how they approach him. And a medieval commentator, Rabbeinu Bachia, says, and this light which shone forth from Moses' face never left him from the time that he was on Mount Sinai. It was with him all his life. Now, just to think for a moment about radiance and veiling and who can see Moses. There's a sentence from the Talmud, from Chagiga 12b, quote, alas for people that they see but do not know what they see. They stand and do not know on what they stand. There's something similar in the New Testament. So in other words, for some people, there is a spiritual light that they don't see. For them, even though the light is shining, it's all darkness. If they were wise, they would understand this, they would discern, but they don't know, they don't understand. They go about in darkness and do not even know, and this is really the point, they don't know that they're walking in darkness. They don't know that the sun is shining. They are blind and don't know that they are blind. That, in some commentaries, and certainly in this passage from the Talmud, is to explain why radiance, on the one hand, is something extraordinary, radiating God's presence, but it is veiled. And sometimes the veil can be over our eyes so that we don't even see the radiance before us. That's one way of understanding the veil. But there are other people, other commentators in Jewish tradition who argue differently. It says in the verses in Exodus that Moses veiled himself only after he finished bringing down the Ten Commandments and speaking to the children of Israel. So there wasn't really a barrier between Moses and the people. Then why did he put on the veil after that? So Abravanel says the reason, his explanation, is that Moses shouldn't use the divine light when he's doing conventional things, eating, drinking, sleeping, talking to his wife about family matters and so on, but only when he's praying, when he's teaching Torah, for instance. So the veil comes as a separation between his general life and also his religious life, a separation between holy and profane. Speaking to God, teaching Torah without the veil, but mundane life, you do it with a veil. Somehow the notion of the veil is to contain your religiosity, give it a special place, keep it holy by covering it up and not bringing it into the marketplace. So Moses has to contain his spirituality. But in this way, what's interesting is that the veil is not between Moses and the people who might look at him, but between Moses's godliness and Moses's humanness. There is a final commentary that comes from a midrash that explains the horns, the Keren Or that Moses developed as actually drops of ink that come from the writing down of the Torah that Moses received at Mount Sinai. In other words, it's the Torah, the divine revelation, that brings about the change in Moses' own appearance. Moses, in this respect, becomes the embodiment as a human being of the Torah, the embodiment of divine revelation, and he's glowing with it. And this radiance and brilliance of his appearance, the medieval commentators say, is recharged every time he teaches Torah and studies Torah and learns more. All right. Does the veil mark Moses as the one who shouldn't be seen or shouldn't see, or the one who is so holy that he wants to preserve that moment of intense religiosity from that moment of revelation, of being with God, and not pollute it with the mundane? I want to come to some points of conclusion by talking about some of these Jewish traditions in a larger context. I was on a panel at the Jewish Museum in Berlin a few years ago, together with a colleague, a Muslim feminist theologian. And the people in the audience had all kinds of questions, but the one that was the most forceful was, why do you Muslim women wear a veil. I found it rather unfriendly, let's say. And I thought that my Muslim colleagues should not have to answer it. So I did. And I pointed out that it's the New Testament that's the only scripture that says women should put on a veil. St. Paul says it. He doesn't have an explanation for it in 1 Corinthians, Paul. He's trying to explain, well, the angels have veil. And he sort of sputters and doesn't really have a reason for it, Paul. And he finally gives up at the end of the chapter. But it's only in the New Testament. It's not in the Quran. It's not in the Hebrew Bible. It's interesting that the New Testament is the only scripture that requires women's veiling. And yet today, all the complaints are about Islam. But I think there's another element here of an important distinction between Christianity and Islam and Judaism. That is, where and how do we gain religious insight? Is it by veiling or by unveiling? And although St. Paul tells women to wear a veil in church and also to be quiet in church, by the way, and not preach, etc., which women were doing in his day, actually, what Christians speak about, what they want, is apocalypse. What is apocalypse? It is from the root in Greek, to reveal. They want things to be revealed. They want to tear away the curtain, to open things up. And I'll give you an example from 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 13. Quote, "We are not like Moses." This is an epistle of Paul. "We are not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from seeing the end of what was passing away." What was passing away, according to Paul, was the Torah, the law. Of course, it wasn't, but that's what he's saying here. And we are not, we, meaning we Christians, are not like Moses, that we put a veil over our face. So women should veil in church, but really Christians want to tear away the veil. Now, we might think of the veil as an act of revealing rather than concealing. The verse in Corinthians talks about the veil as concealing something. Moses put on a veil. They didn't want to see the end, so they veiled, they covered. But let's think about veiling in a different sense. Is veiling also a way to gain insight? So we might ask whether something comes to us, maybe kavod, glory, God's glory, or even perhaps our own glory, only when we are wearing a veil. Let's ask perhaps something about veiling today. We could ask, and I would ask, are there things about Judaism that we veil? Things about ourselves that we veil? What gives us the feeling that we need to veil something anyway? Veiling can often mean, don't talk about this. Don't think about this. Don't know this. It's embarrassing. It's shameful. It's too personal. It's uncomfortable. I think sometimes people go to the synagogue to see their friends, to hear the music, to appreciate the rabbi. But how many people go these days to a synagogue to actually pray? Pray, that is, knowing that God is listening and needing our prayers. How much of Jewish theology and belief in God has been veiled by us out of our own discomfort? A sense that belief in God is somehow primitive and we're modern. We veil belief in God by making a synagogue into an occasion for the family to be together, something good for the children. So the synagogue itself can be a place that is a veil. And I'm just talking about synagogues. I'll let other people worry about their own traditions. Now, of course, we can also ask about veiling of the individual, veiling parts of ourselves, aspects of our inner lives, our weaknesses, our neediness, our longing. The Bible speaks of a longing to see God, to know God, desire and longing and yearning. We don't have that today. And I wonder if maybe we do, but we don't want to know it. What is it we keep veiled away from ourselves? The Bible is speaking about something that was a pretty profound and important human need. What have we done to veil ourselves from being aware of that yearning within ourselves? Sometimes people, it seems to me, bury parts of themselves. They deny that we even have a soul that actually needs nourishment and encouragement, and whose longing and yearning needs to be attended to, heard. But there's also another connotation that's connected to veiling, something important. And that is, and I feel that this is really the most important issue that I want to raise tonight, and I'll stop with this. And that is that sometimes we experience things more deeply when we are veiled. I realized that when I was walking down the aisle at my wedding, that had I been veiled, I could have gone inward and experienced feelings at that moment and not had to think about how people were looking at me and what smile should be on my face. There's a passage in the Bible in Genesis where God tells Abraham, Lech Lecha. It's an odd grammatical construct. Lech means go. Lecha doesn't fit. So it's often ignored in the translation. Just go, God tells Abraham, go forth. Leave your land, leave your family, leave everything, and go to the land that I've promised you. But what does it mean, lech, lecha? What is that second word doing there, lecha? The way it's translated or interpreted in some Jewish tradition is to mean this: go inward. Lecha means to yourself. Go to yourself. Go inward, go into yourself, find out who you are. Why is that important for a religion? Because certainly in Hasidic tradition, your Judaism has to be authentic to who you are. You can't be Jewish like other people. If Judaism is to be authentic to who you are, then you have to know who you are. You have to know who you are authentically. You can't simply be somebody else. You can't be Jewish like your grandparents' Judaism. That would be, my father said, spiritual plagiarism. It's a wonderful phrase. So what that would imply, to go inward, to go into yourself, means veil yourself from the distractions of the world. Veil yourself from all the pulls from outside that try to pull you away from yourself, away from your kavod, from your soul, from your innermost being that you can only encounter, perhaps, when you veil yourself. Immerse yourself, as Moses did. Reorient yourself, reorient your values. What are we doing with our time? There is not only God's glory, and the Psalm says the whole earth is filled with God's glory, but as we've seen from some of the Psalms, human beings have glory as well. So glory, it's not the body, it may not be the soul, but there's something else, some kind of indefinable sensibility that allows us a kind of perception of God, perception of oneself, a perception of the meaning of life, of Torah. And it's that kavod that we try to cultivate and bring forth, but that we can only discover when we turn inward. Inward in a kind of veiling from outside, to look in, and to have the intimacy with oneself that seems to be necessary in order to have an intimacy with other people or with God. So I'm going to stop here, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Am I going to have comments and questions from people?
Okay, we're just unmuting everybody right now, Susannah.
Susannah?
Hi.
Hi, I'd like to thank you for an incredible presentation, biblical scholarship and commentary bar none. So I tentatively walk forward with my reflections. I lead off with, I think it was Tennyson who said, words like nature half reveal and half conceal the soul within. Mm-hmm. And I think from a literary point of view, that's what you've been presenting to us tonight. So here is where my question is. When Adam and Eve left the garden and they became aware of their nakedness, they became aware of their vulnerability, they put on garments of skin. And so in some ways they concealed, in some ways they veiled, they covered themselves with death in order to confront life. So I would be interested, if it's fair to ask, could you wade in on what I'm grappling with? Garments of skin as we go out into the world. I think in some respects our technology are garments of skin. Our words are garments of skin. What do they reveal and what do they conceal? And I think in this age of social media, where, are they revealing or is it concealing who we are? So if you would be so kind, can you offer me some counsel in terms of these reflections?
Wow. I think frankly what you're saying is fascinating and I love it. And I also am struck that the garments of skin, of course, brings me back to Moses and the Karen or the is it horny skin? It's not horny skin, and it's also not horns on the head. But I think that the parallelism is fascinating. And so I think you've touched on something really wonderful. And of course that this is to leave the Garden of Eden means to put on garments that conceal, so that in a sense, leaving the garden means immediately to be veiled. So the greatness of the garden is to be able to take off the veil, take off that which is concealing. So I love what you say. It's wonderful. You should develop it further.
Well, I think you really inspired me in terms of that dual nature of the veil, which both reveals and conceals. And it's not one or the other, right? And yes. So I love your commentary around when we do veil, it gives us the opportunity for an interiority. However, if we identify with the veil, then it denies us the interiority where we would find the God.
Yeah.
So thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
And I wanted to say, to back on what Muriel said, when you were talking about being able to see the body of God and how hard that was and could we do it or not, and my mind went to the Garden of Eden, where before the fall, God just walked around all casual, and there was like no problem with Adam and Eve seeing God, and it was just all out in the open. So there was something like what Muriel said, when that happened, they left the garden, all of a sudden at that point, it was very difficult to see God. So just wondered if you know, this is kind of the same point in the story of being God being revealed, like before, you know, in the garden you could see him, but outside of it, it seems to be a great difficulty. And also, I had a question. Could you ever tell him, is there any indication that when Moses wore his veil, could he see out? Or was he completely, because you said there were different thicknesses of veil. Was he blinded really, like he had to be led around, or could he see through the veil? So to me, that
we don't know. We don't know.
Question. So yeah.
Yeah. No, he was still, when he had the veil lowered, he would talk to the people. So I think that he could see. It was more that they couldn't see him or see his face distinctly. And that's why, you know, the old thing about Jews have horns, this is where it comes from. And of course, that misinterpretation that starts with Jerome in the Vulgate, in the Latin translation, gave rise to all kinds of horrible ideas. The Jews are a devil with horns, but it's a mistranslation, and it also doesn't make sense. Horns and veil doesn't fit. Yeah. I can tell you that there's another biblical scholar, Seth Sanders, who's written about this, and his understanding of Karen Orr goes back to an ancient Babylonian astronomical designation, the designation for an astronomer. Doesn't matter, I have to go into it, but it's a signal of someone who has reached great heights as a spiritual leader and as leader of the people. So his explanation, of course, makes much more sense. But I think in the question of the garden also, when God says, where are you? Where are you? That's also implying not only are we somehow now separated from God, but that God is separated from us. That God doesn't know us in the immediate way and has to say, where are you? So there's a way in which God is also left at some distance from the people that he had just created and put in the garden. It said reciprocity comes up often in the Bible. Hi, yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for your wonderful, inspiring presentation. Your comments about the significance of the veil in your wedding experiences and turning inward spoke to me the most, because I've been trying to prepare to do, I'm a painter also, not just an educator, to do a series of paintings that I feel drawn to do on meditation. And of course, with meditation, you have to turn inward, and it makes me think of prayer shawls. And, you know, is that like something that you would think of with veiling, or am I completely looking in the wrong direction with that, as far as why you would veil yourself?
Exactly. Yes, I completely agree. And I guess what I like about a prayer shawl, that it's open to anybody. Well, I mean, it's traditionally only worn by men, but nowadays worn by women as well. And so I agree. I think actually the prayer shawl is a way of enveloping oneself and being a kind of physical reminder of wanting to be enveloped by God's presence. And so it is both cutting oneself off from the rest of the world and focusing and turning inward and wanting to be embraced, to feel an embrace from God, and to be aware of longing for that embrace, wanting it, and that's something that we should want as human beings. We want to be held, to be embraced. So yeah, I agree, it's important.
You know, so much of what I find profound about your work and your approach to material is where many people take what was at one time spiritual and they contemporize it. And we look at it through the lens of modernity, where, you know, the veil, I'm sure many people would give a lecture and say the veil is all about the oppression of women, all about the oppression. And what you're doing is you're getting to what I think is the spiritual significance of the image. And that is absolutely profound in my opinion. To see, you know, what is the real meaning? When you talk about the wedding story, which is, it's a great story, and then when you talk about the veil, I mean, look at what you said, that it's an experience of going more deeply internal, to inside yourself, because you are veiled from the outer world that you can only see internally. It's brilliant. And again, it goes against the grain of what I'm sure 90% of the people would be saying about it. And this is why I feel your approach is truly spiritual. It's not religious in that. I mean, there is a difference many times where it's not just a canon that becomes stale. It's about experience. And when you talk about going inside, you're talking about a felt spiritual experience that's been with humanity from the beginning of time, which you're reminding us about. And this is one of the symbols that's been with humanity that remind us of the absolute need to go inside. So I'm so deeply touched by what you've done tonight. What you've done many times for us, and you've done tonight.
Well, thank you. I mean, I understand why the veil is seen as a tool of oppression of women and sexist and so on. I mean, that was my initial reaction all my life. And then, of course, the question is, can I also see that there's something very important that I can make it into something else for myself? And that's always the challenge. What can I make of this? I also think, though, that what you were just saying about how we take something spiritual and we try to modernize, we lose something. And I think that what strikes me about this is that there are experiences described in the Bible that we don't even think about anymore. So, and we should, because I think it's part of what it is to be a human being. And that includes things like yearning and longing, desire for God. That's a pretty important part of our human existence. And yet we're losing that today. We don't think about it enough. And perhaps also the language we use. You know, the word kavod in modern Hebrew means honor or dignity, but they don't even have the meaning of glory because the language has been secularized. So this religious notion of kavod, of God's kavod, it's not about God's honor and dignity. What does that mean? We don't think about it anymore, and I wish we would.
Maybe one more question and we'll let you go. It's been a long night for you and a long day, I'm sure.
That's fine.
Maybe one more question. Use this opportunity, everybody.
I think you speak about the, the revealing and the concealing. So I'm obviously kind of reiterating something here, but when we talk about the garden, we talk about Adam and Eve being clothed in glory. And so I think that's what we're talking about, where the vulnerability and the willingness to see and be seen. And then because of the fall, then we must veil and we must find our way back to the garden, because there's actually the tree of the knowledge of God. And that's the way back is through the labor and through the toil of wearing those garments of skin, that we return perhaps to the garments of glory, when we can, as you said so beautifully, where the veil is no longer a distraction, that the veil is the opportunity to see and be seen. So beautiful, beautiful commentary. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there was somebody else who was about to ask a question.
I was going to just say something. When I think of a veil, or when I see someone that's veiled, or whatever metaphor that means, it's leaving room for imagination.
Oh, yeah.
And then when you are turning inward is when it's a time for imagination. So that's what was evoked for me when you're talking about the veil.
Uh-huh. That's very interesting that you say that, because you bring something to mind with this, and that is when you're veiled, when you're not looking directly face to face, as you just said, it opens possibilities of imagination. And then I'm thinking, when I'm looking face to face at somebody, I'm always interpreting. There's always a process of interpretation, even an unconscious process of, how does this person feel? Did I say the right thing? Or what should I say? You know, we're working together straight. And so it just occurs to me, actually, if you think about psychotherapy when the patient is lying down and not looking at the therapist, as possibly offering more room for the imagination as opposed to face, when there are a certain caution may come in, or certain hesitancy, when they're more involved in interpretation than in imagination.
Well, and then also if Moses was unveiled and he had the face of God, or he'd seen God, maybe that would be giving away too much. And that way, if he was veiled, it would still leave the open to imagination of people's vision of God, of what God looks like.
Yes, I like that. Yeah. I think also what you're pointing to when you just said that was that when we speak about God or think about God, what we don't want is some clearly defined definition. We're not looking for a definition. We're looking for some inspiration. And the veil, again, as you said, it's about allows imagination to have that opportunity of imagination. You know, everything is so regulated. Imagination and not to have things be so explicit. Yeah. So to be inspired rather than defined.
Which kind of goes back to what Maria was saying too, with the skin. It's to leave room. You have clothing to leave room for imagination.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Exactly.
Well, everybody, but Susannah, Dr. Heschel, thank you so much. Again,
My pleasure.
From the response, it's a brilliant presentation, and it's
great to be with you.
Well, and it's so fitting to what the CC Institute's about, where you're looking at the ontology, the ontological roots of something. And that's what you've done. You demonstrated what this work has been about for 30 years for us. I mean, we're babies. We're new kids on the block when you look at the ancient traditions, the Talmudic traditions and the commentaries. And so thank you. And for those of you that are somewhat new to the community, give a call. You know, we have many programs. I don't want to get into all the stuff we do right now. Muriel, who's on here tonight, is our new co-director of studies, doing a wonderful job. Days of our development. So thank all of you. And you're probably, you know, in our program right now, we have probably 12 different countries represented, you know, and I love it. I love seeing it because it brings such cultural diversity to this work. So thank you. Thank you, Dr. Heschel, all of you.
Thank you.
Butch for helping me with the organization of this, and Jennifer for putting it together. Thank all of you. It takes a village, right?
Yeah. Be well. All the best. Bye-bye.
Ciao. Vediamo. Ciao.
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 Bye.
Good night, all.
Good night, everybody. You
Good
get
night.
no one to leave. You see this? There's no one to leave.
I'm leaving. Bye, Max.
Good night.
Sleep tight.
That was good.